Okay, so we are live right now on YouTube and Facebook. Hello out there for all of you checking in. Welcome to this exciting event tonight. This is the fifth program of 5 for the summer. So we saved the best for last. My name is Steve Myers. I'm with the Cedarville Area Historical Society. Yours was really good too, John, last time. Yours was really awesome. So yeah, yours was awesome too, so I just wanted to make sure I got that in there. So where was I? Oh yeah, Cedarville Area Historical Society. This is a great place to be a part of. We do lots of cool stuff. We talk about history of Cedarville. We talk about lots of things. We get together. We do all kinds of stuff. We're trying to expand, come up with more ideas. We have a great presence on social media, Facebook, YouTube. We have past videos of programs on YouTube and Facebook, so feel free to look at past programs from the summer even. So next year we're working on some new ideas, programs, and really if you have any ideas, bring them up, because every time we have a program, something comes up, it's like, boy, we can do a whole program just on that topic. So anything that interests you is fair game. So just get in touch with one of us. And by the way, if you're watching online, this is a free event for you, live streaming. So I did leave a little caption in there that if you feel inspired to support us, there's a link right there on the website that you can donate. Because I think all of you, unless you got past Galen, I don't think you got past him. So
how has the year been?
You supported us. I'm sorry?
How has the year been financially?
The year's been very good to us, and on the other hand, not so good. Good in the fact that we've had a lot of donations, but we've also lost members. Thanks for asking that. Got me all emotional now. Jim Bade, Harlan, and who else? Paul Fry. So with that, we've had memorials that have come in that we're going to put to good use. So thank you for asking that. All right. So tonight. We have our special member, Andy Dvorak, Dr. Andy, we call him. He has a history background. He actually taught my son at Highland College, history class. And in fact, when we were getting set up, my son in Hawaii FaceTimed me, and I said, "Hey, do you remember Mr. Dvorak? He was your teacher at Highland." It's like, hey, and he's like, "Look where I am now because of you. You've inspired me." That kind of thing. So
that's all because
it was pretty special. Pretty special. So we're excited about this topic. Lost Lake, not the one in Dixon. This is the one in Stephenson County. So if you do any Googling, probably add Vladimirovo to it, and you'll get to the right place. But I don't want to talk too much about this, but it's a very interesting topic. A lot of you are here because of that, but most of you are here because Andy's going to be up here, and he's always a treat to listen to. So after this is finished, we have refreshments in the back. We usually hang out and have side conversations and talk and have a lot of fun. So have a good time tonight. And questions, if you have questions, feel free. If you're online, we'll be watching some of your comments and I'll present those at opportune times if you have a question out there, and Andy will answer those as well. So, Andy.
Thanks a lot. Thanks for coming tonight. I have some acknowledgments to make, but I think I'll wait about halfway through the presentation to make them. It'll make more sense when I make the acknowledgments then. So anyway, I came up with this idea. We're kicking around ideas on the Cedarville Historical Board, and all of a sudden it occurred to me, how about Lost Lake? And it was interesting that I usually find that people who live in Stephenson County, or even in this area, about half the people know about Lost Lake, and the other half never heard of it. You know, and it's like 7.5 miles down the road here on Cedarville Road. So anyway, we'll be looking at Vladimirovo, and it is a little bit of old Russia in northwest Illinois. It's another immigrant story, I guess you could say, that we have so many of them here in the United States. So I thought what would be best is if we started with a description of, what is Lost Lake, or Vladimirovo. By the way, Vladimirovo essentially means Vladimir's town. Okay. So, okay. Oops. It's on. It's not working. There it goes. Okay. So, what is Vladimirovo Lost Lake? The location of it is actually at the intersection of Cedarville Road and Rock City Road. So, this is the intersection right here. And if you drove a little bit fast along Cedarville Road, you'd miss it. The archway that you saw in the last picture is about right here, and there are a couple of other entrances. But otherwise, it's pretty well secluded in kind of a wooded area. There is a Russian Orthodox church there, St. Vladimir's, and a lake, of course, Lost Lake here, where there is a summer camp for mainly Russian American kids every summer. And it's the western part of the settlement is pretty much the summer camp, the church, and the lake. The eastern part of the settlement is pretty much the residential area there. Okay. Now, it's mainly populated by the descendants of Russian refugees, mainly displaced by World War II. And there's also a sprinkling of some other people, some people of Ukrainian descent, Polish descent, and a few others. The population is about 150, 160 or so. And every summer they have a camp serving about 80 campers. They're both boys and girls, by the way. The Vladimirovo settlement was established in 1961. And again, it was settled mainly by Russian Americans from Chicago. Okay.
What year did you say?
1961. Okay, now Lost Lake itself was created in 1837 when Michael Shane dammed up Brown Creek, and here you see Brown Creek, to build a grist mill there. And so kind of a similar story to John Adams coming to Cedarville and starting his grist mill as well. Now the land changed hands over the years. By the 1870s, a Reuben Cotherman was milling there from about the 1870s until about the turn of the 20th century. In about 1900, he tried to turn it into kind of a public recreation area, but didn't seem to work out very well. And soon after that, another owner, Elmer Barker, took it over and filled in the lake and actually farmed the land until about 1920, when a Thomas Lincoln purchased the site and tried, along with his sons, to restore the lake. They refilled it, and tried to develop it as a kind of a duck hunting preserve. And it was Lincoln and his sons who apparently named it Lost Lake, because it was created, lost, and then found again, apparently. By the mid-20th century, the site was owned by a Mr. and Mrs. Glenn Thompson, who farmed the land. And they were the ones that sold it to the Russian Americans from Chicago. All right. Oops. I'm the wrong way now.
Push the button on the arrow.
All right.
The down arrow.
There we go. That works out pretty well. All right. Well, I thought we'd spend some time looking at kind of the background of Russia and the Russian Orthodox Church to kind of give us some context here. What came to be Russia emerged around two core locations in about a little over 1,000 years ago, in the 900s. Here to the south, you have what becomes Kievan Rus, and then to the north, Novgorod. And this fellow over here, Vladimir I, kind of consolidated the two in the 970s or so. And he became known as Prince Vladimir the Great. And he's also credited with being not only the father of today's Russia, but he was also the father of Orthodox Christianity in Russia as well. In fact, he converted to Orthodox Christianity, which of course was centered in Constantinople, which is now Istanbul, which I guess the best way to describe Orthodox Christianity is it's the eastern half of what would be the Roman Catholic Church was the western half, the Orthodox Church was the eastern half. Constantine converted the Roman Empire to Christianity in the 300s. And then when the western part of the empire collapsed, the western part of the empire became the center of the Roman Catholic Church centered in Rome, and the eastern part of the church in Constantinople, or Istanbul. And they were associated with each other for hundreds and hundreds of years, but finally around 1054, finally just split in two. Now the question always quite often comes up, why Orthodox Christianity? Why did he convert to Orthodox Christianity? Do you want to hear the myth story first, or do you want to hear the joke part of it is that he had his choice. He could convert to Judaism, Roman Catholicism, Islam, or Eastern Orthodoxy. Okay? The story was that he saw Judaism as a defeated religion because the Jews were dispossessed. So he didn't want to convert to Judaism. Roman Catholicism he wasn't interested in because that was a centralized church in Rome and he didn't want to have to answer to the Roman Catholic Church. And he wasn't going to convert to Islam because they wouldn't allow Russians to drink. And you can't do that to the Russians, right? So Eastern Orthodoxy was the only possible choice. Well, I mean that's the myth. The reality is that he wanted to develop an alliance with Emperor Basil II in Constantinople. In fact, he married Basil's sister. So there was a kind of a military alliance and a political alliance there. And of course, converting doesn't hurt to convert to the church too. So that's pretty much why that was done. Now, this is going to be pretty crucial for the development of Europe, because what this means is that it helps to keep Russia distant from Western Europe. In the first place, they inherited the Greek alphabet, or what's going to be known as the Cyrillic alphabet, because the monks, of course, Constantinople, and they had the Greek alphabet, not the Latin alphabet. And the two monks, Cyril and Methodius, were sent to Russia to convert the Russians. So the alphabet, the Russian alphabet, is known as the Cyrillic alphabet. Also, Eastern Orthodoxy is characterized by having their church structure develop along nationality lines, where the Roman Catholic Church was the universal church in Western Europe. The Orthodox Church was split up into various nationalities, so there's a Russian Orthodox Church, Greek Orthodox Church, Serbian Orthodox Church, Bulgarian Orthodox Church, and so forth. So that's another big difference. Now, on the other hand, Russian Orthodoxy becomes a unifying force within Russia, though. It becomes the faith in Russia. And the emperor, or the czar, was seen as the little father, or the vicar of Christ on earth, kind of like God's representative on earth. And there was a very close alliance between church and state, of course. Okay. All right. And here you see probably the most famous Russian Orthodox church, or one of the most famous in the world, St. Basil's Cathedral in Red Square in Moscow. And notice the characteristic onion domes of the Russian Orthodox Church. All right. Now, there were very few Russians in the United States before the 1880s or so. There's a small group in Pennsylvania that settled in Pennsylvania in the 1790s. And of course, there were a few in Alaska. Alaska was, of course, part of Russia until 1867, when the Russians sold Alaska to the United States. So really the only Russians, you had a sprinkling of Russians on the East Coast and then on the West Coast, mainly in the San Francisco area before the 1880s. The first major wave, the first wave of Russian immigrants started coming in the 1880s, and between 1880 and 1914, over 3 million Russian immigrants came to the United States. Both Orthodox Christian Russians and a lot of Russian Jews, particularly from the so-called Pale of Settlement. Remember, at that time, Poland was a part of Russia, and anyone who's seen Fiddler on the Roof knows that story, that as far as anti-Semitism is concerned, the Russians were the champions of that before the Germans later on. So a lot of those people ended up immigrating to the United States. And most of those Russians were peasants and unskilled workers. So farmers and unskilled workers for the most part. And most of them settled in New York and other large eastern and midwestern cities, particularly cities like Buffalo, Pittsburgh, Detroit, Milwaukee, Chicago, and so forth. By 1914, you could walk for blocks, for instance, on the Lower East Side of Manhattan, and only hear Russian, Polish, and Yiddish spoken quite often. You go blocks and blocks, and that's what you would hear. Some famous Russians who came from this wave, who became, their descendants later on, Irving Berlin, David Sarnoff, who was the founder of NBC, Kirk Douglas, Walter Matthau, Natalie Wood, were all people who came from this immigration. Okay, so you have a large number, really over 3 million. Then there's a second wave of immigration between about 1917 and 1924, triggered by the Russian Revolution, or the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917. And about 30,000, a much smaller number, fled to the United States. And of course, many of them were more upper middle and middle class. A lot of them were czarist officials. They were in the Russian military. They were teachers, lawyers, clergy. They were often referred to as white Russians to make them distinct from the red Russians, who were the ones that precipitated the Russian Revolution. And of course, for the most part, they were fiercely anti-communist. The famous members and descendants of the second wave included a lot of people in engineering and the arts, people like Igor Sikorsky, who is quite often credited with being the founder of, or the creator of the helicopter, essentially. Vladimir Nabokov, the novelist, Igor Stravinsky, the composer, George Balanchine. What also happened was the creation, in the 1920s, the creation of the Russian Orthodox Church outside of Russia, which by 1930 had 120,000 members in the United States. Now, a third wave of Russian immigrants came after the Second World War, and these were for the most part the DPs, the displaced persons. They were Eastern Europeans, a lot of them Russian, but also there were Poles and Ukrainians and people from the Baltic states and so forth. This is pretty much the third wave. There were as many as 65 million people were forced from their homes during World War II, and there were about 15 million still homeless at the end of the war. They remained displaced, and probably more than half of those came from Eastern Europe. Now, the DP issue, or displaced person issue, was extremely complicated when it came to refugees from the former Soviet Union. At the Yalta Conference in February of 1945, the United States and the Soviet Union agreed to return each other's prisoners of war and refugees, regardless of their personal wishes. By the end of September 1945, the Soviets had repatriated over 5 million people that had been returned to the Soviet Union. Although there were still about 500,000 or more that refused to return. And there were a number of reasons for that. And by the way, here you see, these are Russian women who were essentially slave laborers. What the Germans did when they retreated from Russia was they took a lot of the young, healthy people back with them to work in forced labor. I mean, some of them, of course, that were Jews ended up in concentration camps, but others were in forced labor camps. And these women are some of the forced laborers at the end of the war. Now, at Potsdam, the idea of repatriating people back home continued, although there was a lot of jockeying around of people who were refugees trying to leave the Russian zone of occupation, trying to get to the American or British or French zones, because they didn't want to go back. In the first place, if you're sent back to the Soviet Union, how do you prove you didn't collaborate with the Germans? You know? And a lot of those people were being accused of that. And of course, some of them did collaborate with the Germans. There were some Ukrainians that did. A lot of the people from the Baltic states did, because they didn't want to be a part of the Soviet Union to begin with. So this became a very complicated issue. Now, of the people that did not go back to the Soviet Union, many of them pretty much figured out the obvious way, well, not most of them, but a lot of them, but the obvious way of avoiding repatriation was to claim another nationality. No, I'm not Russian. I'm Polish, or I'm whatever, Serbian, or whatever. And so, a lot of that was done as well. Now, most of these refugees ended up in either Germany or Austria at the end of the war. And here you see what Europe pretty much looked like by 1947-48. Of course, the Soviet Union was the ally of the United States, Britain, and France during the war. But once the common enemy was gone, the ideological differences between the Soviet Union and the Western allies became pretty clear. And here you can see where the armies ended up at the end of the war. And it was agreed that Germany, of course, Germany loses a fair amount of territory to the east, and then Austria as well, because Austria had been incorporated into Germany just before the Second World War. Germany and Austria were divided into occupation zones. And here you have the Russian zone to the east, the British zone over here, the French zone, and then the American zone, which overlaps both Austria and Germany in this area right here. So, so there were about 500,000 Eastern European DPs that were still there by 1948. People without a home, basically, people without a country. In June of 1948, the U.S. Congress passed the Displaced Persons Act. And by 1948, the Cold War was on. There was no longer this cooperation of returning people back and forth. So the Displaced Persons Act enabled about 400,000 refugees from the East to enter the United States between 1948 and 1952, while another 100,000 were accepted by about 20 other nations. Now this story, I got a lot of my information from this story from Remy C. French Gerard's master's thesis, Vladimirovo of Lost Lake and Displaced People Found. She wrote this in 2001, and when I read her thesis, I was amazed to discover that her professor and my professor were the same, except I was there 10 or 12 years earlier than she was. But Mark Wyman was my last dissertation advisor, and she based a good deal of her book, or at least the information about displaced persons, on Mark Wyman's book. And he wrote a lot about immigration. And there's an excellent book that he wrote entitled DP, Europe's Displaced Persons from 1945 to 1951. And as I read what she wrote and Dr. Wyman wrote, I was amazed at how much it reflected my mother's story. My mother was Claudia Ivanovna Kirpichenko Dvorak, who was half Ukrainian and half Russian. And she was one of these people who ended up in forced labor camp at the end of the war. At the end of the war, she was 20 years old. And actually toured much of Eastern Europe in a boxcar, talked about how Jews were being separated out along the way. Now, after the war, my father was an American occupation soldier in the American zone here. And my mother was on the border here in a town called Passau, on the kind of the German, Czech, Austrian border. And that's where they met, and they ended up marrying in 1951. So, although I'm from Iowa, I'm not from Vladimirovo. But anyway, I discovered that when I came to Freeport, somebody who I was teaching with, I don't know, anybody here remember Wendell Kerr? Okay, Wendell taught both German and Russian. When he found out what my background was, he said, "You know about Vladimirovo?" I said, "No." He told me about it, so I went up to Vladimirovo. And then a few years later, I became more acquainted with it. In fact, I always regretted that my mother died just a few years after I moved here. I never got her to Vladimirovo, although my old Orthodox priest from Iowa, we went to actually to St. Vladimir Day for a couple of summers in about 2003 and 2004. Got to know some people there. So anyway, that's my roundabout story about how I got interested in this. Okay. All right, so that brings us to Chicago. You have those 400,000 displaced persons who come to the United States. And of course, a lot of, because of those earlier waves of immigration, there were already Russian Americans living here. And Chicago became the second largest center for these displaced persons, New York being first, Chicago second, and it made sense to send the displaced persons there because there were already Russian American communities already existing there. And in Chicago, Logan Square, the Logan Square neighborhood was where the greatest concentration of Russian immigrants were there. And this man is Archbishop Seraphim. He becomes Archbishop of Chicago in 1957. And the main church there is the Holy Virgin Protection Cathedral on Kedzie Avenue. He's the Archbishop there. And what happens is that the congregation, including Father Seraphim, became concerned that the young people in the Russian community were slowly losing their heritage, losing their language, losing their customs, and so forth. So in the summer of 1960, Archbishop Seraphim began assembling the children from the diocese for instruction in the Russian language and culture. They also organized a unit of Russian scouts, Russian Boy Scouts essentially, which went all the way back to 1909. I guess the Tsar, Nicholas II, organized the first Boy Scouts in Russia at that time. Soon, more and more, the older children and their parents increasingly desired to create some sort of scouting camp where they could go for the summer, basically. So they began to organize musical fundraisers to raise money for this camp. They eventually raised about $10,000 by the end of 1960. Then they began to search for the perfect place to have this camp. Now, on a May day in 1961, Archbishop Seraphim and a friend began driving west from Chicago. They were determined they were just going to start looking around and seeing a place that would be the ideal location. They got caught in a heavy rainstorm and stopped at a farm to ask directions. And the woman that greeted them was Mrs. Glenn Thompson. She and her husband were farmers of this land. And Archbishop Seraphim explained to her what they were doing, that they were looking for land for the summer camp. And she said, well, why don't you buy the land that you're standing on right now? We're ready to sell. And the wooded property was ideal. You had this lake, this lost lake there. You had some woods. It was a kind of a perfect place for a summer camp. Now, although Father Seraphim agreed to the purchase, he still needed another $20,000 because she wanted about $30,000 for the property. So the following Sunday, after morning services, he brought along about 20 parishioners from the church in Chicago. They had a picnic at Lost Lake, and the parishioners fell in love with the land and insisted that they buy it. And they ended up buying 50 one-acre lots, a 4-acre lake, and a 3-acre forest. And they paid Mrs. Thompson $30,000 the day after she turned down another offer of $28,000. The parish put down $13,000 in cash, and they borrowed $17,000 for that purpose. So in May 1961, the diocese acquires Lost Lake. Now, eventually, this land, the lots were sold for between $500 and $600 per lot. So that pretty much paid for the cost of the land. Now they had to build a community. They had to build a summer camp. They had to build a church. And here you see the tents that they had there as they were building. The church went up in about 3 months. They built it very, very quickly. And the first summer camp was held in July of 1961, 2 months after the purchase. So they moved right along. And here you see some of the early campers here. The first camp, the first arch that they built here over the camp. Okay. Now, most of the early residents were Russian immigrants from Chicago. But one of the first residents actually was George Guestvent. I don't know if anybody knew George. I'm sorry? He did. He was already living in Freeport when they bought the land here. He worked at Microswitch, right? And so he was one of the early residents. He became the first vice president of the St. Vladimir Cultural Association. And soon others followed from Chicago. And some of the first families actually supported two homes, one in Chicago, one here. And then some of them eventually, of course, retired and then just moved here. So the church was built, and of course the church was built in typical Russian style with the onion dome, and an adjoining bell tower was also built. By the time of the first camp in July of 1961, 11 families were already building permanent homes. So you had, by the end of the summer of 1961, you had the beginnings of a settlement at Lost Lake. The camp welcomed 50 campers the first year. And the camp originally ran for 6 weeks, early July to mid-August, and cost $20 per week. But no child was turned away because of inability to pay. And the early staff donated their time and their skills. Now, the camp was originally created for the children of the Diocese of Chicago and Detroit, but the camp is independent from the diocese. They have their own board. In addition to the scouting program, a girls' guide program was created as well. And the boys and girls each had their own uniform. Early on, the summer camp was really quite regimented. In the first years, the camp was conducted entirely in Russian. It was required that the children learn Russian. No other language was permitted. The mornings were devoted to lessons about the Orthodox faith, about the Russian language, history, and culture, along with wilderness survival, orienteering, and water skills. They also learned Russian folk dances and folk songs, and they closed the camp each year with the St. Vladimir's Day festival. After lunch, the campers played sports, participated in swimming, hiking, archery, softball, volleyball. After supper, quite often there was a night hike or a campfire, or in bad weather they would have a film or a movie. And then prayers were given all through the day. The religious instruction was pretty heavy as well. Now, not surprisingly, close friendships were formed over the years, with romances blossoming between campers and also between counselors. And it was estimated that about a dozen marriages resulted from the first 4 years of the camp. All right. And here you see some of the these are more the residential areas and some of the older homes in the community. And notice the names of the streets. You have Sikorsky Street, Pushkin Street, Tchaikovsky Street. And a couple of other homes there. Now, Archbishop Seraphim lived to the ripe old age of 90. He lived until 1987, so he lived long enough to see pretty much Vladimirovo or Lost Lake become a thriving little village. All right, now there's a fourth wave of Russian migration that comes in the 1980s and the 1990s. Illinois state health laws limited the camp to a maximum of 80 campers at a time. And in the first decade or two, they were pretty much full with campers. However, by the 1980s, this declined to only about 40 campers a year. The problem was that the first campers had reached adulthood already, but they were still too young to have children of their own that could come to the camp. And by the way, the ages of the campers were between about 7 and 18 were the ages, pretty much. Now, and of course, because of the Iron Curtain, new families couldn't immigrate either. Now, that began to change in the 1970s, slowly. The fourth wave of Russian immigrants began with the so-called Jackson-Vanik Amendment to the Trade Act of 1974 with the Soviet Union. In exchange for most favored nation status as far as trade, the Soviets agreed to lift the restrictions on the immigration of Russian Jews in exchange for this. And more than 400,000 Jewish so-called refuseniks who had been refused the chance to immigrate left the Soviet Union between the early 70s and 1990 or so. And about 100,000 of those came to the U.S., although again, they were mainly Jewish. The fourth wave picked up steam after Gorbachev came to power in the late 1980s. And then, of course, what quickly followed was the fall of the Berlin Wall, the fall of the Soviet Union, and of course, this kind of opened the doors to further immigration. By the end of the 1990s, well over half of Russian immigrants to the United States were academics, scientists, professional, and technical workers. And this led to an influx of Russian Orthodox believers to the United States, and also quite a few conversions of native-born Americans to Russian Orthodoxy as well. Now, this actually led to a waiting list for summer camp by 1995. And in recent years, campers have come not only from the Chicago area, but from all across the United States and Canada, and some as far away as Russia. Today, the camp operates for only 4 weeks instead of 6, and is no longer conducted entirely in Russia to kind of accommodate people who had converted and so forth. Although speaking Russian is strongly encouraged. There have been something like over 3,000 campers since 1961. Okay, so I thought we'd kind of look at Vladimirovo in recent years. It's slowly changing, thriving as well. Here you see a scene from the summer camp. We've got a bonfire going there. And here's the interior of St. Vladimir's. I don't know how many of you have ever been inside a Russian Orthodox church, but I mean the icons, it's really quite beautiful. The icons and that sort of thing. Also, the Russians, most of their burials from the community occur in the Rock City Cemetery. If you go to the Rock City Cemetery just south of Rock City, which is only 3 miles away from Vladimirovo, you'll see a lot of Russian Orthodox crosses there in the cemetery. For the most part, the residents have been able to pretty much live at peace with their outside neighbors, although sometimes not so much. They've been among the most loyal of Americans, mainly because of the Cold War, but also because of the Cold War, they were often looked on with suspicion, too. Once in the 1960s, some residents were shot at from a passing car. And there were some splits among the residents themselves over Russian traditions. Of course, you tend to see this in immigrant communities. The people that want to keep the old traditions versus those that want to adapt to newer conditions. There have been complaints that the Russian language has been vulgarized, that the younger people are not so interested in the traditions anymore. Some of the younger folks prefer to just forget the Soviet and even the Russian past. And there's also debates over whether to use traditional church Slavonic during the church services versus English. Kind of mirrors the Catholic Church arguments over Latin versus English as well. By the way, the the church on Kedzie Avenue in Chicago was moved to Des Plaines in 1990. I guess what happened there is that the neighborhood really changed, and the claim was that the neighborhood became so rough that the parishioners would find their cars stripped or stolen during the services. They'd come out and their car was gone. So, and of course, there was quite a bit of white flight, which was, of course, a part of, after the unrest of the 1960s, the assassinations and so forth. A lot of white Chicagoans fled to the suburbs and beyond. So that was part of that too. There was a yearning, of course, for the peace and serenity of the countryside. It's a great place to live, one resident said in 1999. I don't have to worry about my children running in the street, and everybody takes care of everybody. Okay. And here you see some of the campers with some Orthodox priests and a camp counselor. And here are some of the Girl Guides and the Boy Scouts. The uniforms look similar, but they're different. And so there's the lake, the dock. They built that dock very early on. And you see the flag that you see there is the old imperial Russian flag without the Tsar's insignia, but it's pretty much the old Russian flag. Family Day at camp. And again, there have been well over 3,000 campers since 1961. The fellow you see here, this is Father Alexander George. He was he baptized my brother and me many, many years ago. He was from Cedar Rapids. And when our mother died, I didn't realize he was still around. And I talked to the funeral home people, and that we live in a town about 60 miles from Cedar Rapids, and I said, it's too bad that Father George still isn't around here. I thought he had moved away long. He said, I just saw him last week. He said, he's around here. So he did the funeral services for our mother, and then we invited him to Freeport, and I had heard that there's the St. Vladimir Days festival was going on. This was in, I think, both 2003 and 2004. We took him out to Vladimirovo, and he really enjoyed himself out there. So, anyway, that's a little bit of old Russia in northwest Illinois. Anybody have any questions or comments or memories of their own?
Was that privately owned for a while? The reason I say is, remember, Jim, they lived right across from the grocery store up here, that brick house, that lady and her son and wife lived there, and the lady, like, they had something to do with that camp, and almost like, I can't believe they owned it, but they had something to do with Lost Lake. And I'm not sure, this had to be in the 90s or early 2000s.
Did they own property there? Did they own
I'm not quite sure. I thought they talked like they owned the camp, but I don't know how they would have owned the camp. That had to be separate with the board.
Well, I think there's the board that pretty much runs the camp and runs the settlement, but
I
yeah.
can't remember the name. I remember we did business with them, but it's been so long ago. But like the mother was involved, but she didn't live around here. But her son lived kitty corner from the old grocery store here in Cedarville.
Okay.
So I'm not sure what I wouldn't think they would have owned the camp. That was run by that church.
Yeah, right. The diocese, right. Well, the diocese set it up, but they had a separate board that actually ran the camp, right.
Can you go back a few slides to the sign that you had?
Keep going.
No, just sort of the keep out sign.
Oh, the keep out sign, okay.
Yeah.
Good.
I have been by Vladimirovo several times driving, and I've been curious about it, but I've never pulled in because of that.
Because I
sign.
think you're
I think
safer.
I've made a good choice.
Well, if you go in on the west side where the lake is and the church is, and the arch, that's where the arch is. If you go in there, nobody's going to bother you. It's, you know, you're there to see the church or whatever. Nobody's going to bother you. If you go down another block or two, there's another entrance, and that's more residential. And I just on Sunday, Susie and I drove around there, and nobody bothered us. I mean, I think if you linger there for a while, it looks like you're up to no good, you know.
Hey, I'm retired librarian.
I think you're probably all right. You're probably all right.
So even the fourth wave of people hardly changed the population of Lost Lake.
No.
And so the whole purpose of the Lost Lake was this camp program that lasted about 6 weeks out of.
It used to be
the whole year
6
of
weeks.
52.
Now it's 4. Although about half of it is residential. So you've got about, I don't know, there's like 42, 43 homes there, I think. So you got about 150 people. And then people pass it on, I think, to their children and so forth. So, and of course their land is rather limited there, so I don't think it expand very much. Yes, sir.
Part of my interest coming tonight, I volunteer at our local museum, and one day I'm out in my day there, and all of a sudden 2 vans pull in, and the kids come spilling out, and about 20 of their day campers decided the thing to do today was to tour our museum. So I survived it. I don't have a good reputation for being great with kids, but I survived it. But it was quite an experience.
Is that in Freeport or?
Yeah, on Carroll Street. So
Okay, right.
normally that size group's nice to give us a little warning. All of a sudden, oh, here we go. We want a tour. Oh, okay. Don't touch that. Don't touch that. Because there were maybe 2 adults, and they were just watching too. So we go in the room, and you take off everywhere. Come back here, but it was interesting. So it piqued my interest in the community.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yes, ma'am.
I used to go there with my cousins and go ice skating, of course, before 61.
Mhm.
But what happened to the farm buildings? Are they?
Now, when my dad was a little boy, my grandma and grandpa lived on the farm that was there at Lost Lake.
The Thompson?
This had to be mid-20s, I guess.
Oh, okay. So that was the Brown?
Huh?
Was that-
You didn't have their name. They lived there, they farmed it. Maybe they were just working for the farm or something.
Okay.
But they lived in the back there at the Lost Lake Farm.
Mm-hmm.
And one comment my dad always made, that house was so cold, and it didn't have any closets, our clothes just hung on the nails on the walls in the winter. The clothes were frozen to the walls. But,
There is, and they've got something on their fundraising page. And we actually, when we drove through there, we saw there's an old barn that's about ready to go down.
way past the
Yes,
back of the
past the lake, right.
The buildings were back there.
The barn is still there, and I don't know, maybe the houses are still there and they've been renovated?
I don't think
I don't
most
know.
of the building, I
No.
think they're gone.
Maybe the
But-
vultures.
But it was a real active fishing spot then, in the 50s.
Uh-huh.
I remember going there fishing with my grandpa. He was a good friend of Mr. Thompson's.
Mhm.
And the Thompsons went to Florida in the winter.
Oh, okay.
So then, this is my cousin, we could go out, we went out there ice skating. We probably weren't supposed to be there, but we were out there ice skating. And we went out there with our uncles and stuff, and they took us out there and we went ice skating.
Mhm. Great memories.
But I can remember Grandpa and Grandma always talking about living at Lost Lake and stuff.
Mhm.
And
So you think that house that, I just wondered if somebody moved to use the house, but if it was that bad.
No, if it was an old, it was. I'm
Well, the
sure-
barn's still standing. It's,
So-
it's,
Well, I haven't driven back in there at all, for, you know. But we lived in Dakota, so I mean, Lost Lake was always, you know,
just there.
yeah.
Yeah.
And my grandma and grandpa lived just south of, between halfway between there and Rydot.
Mhm.
And, you know, and then my husband's farm family, they farmed a farm that was just up Browns Creek there, about a half a mile. And the funny thing is, it was a Henny farm. It was owned by the Henny family.
Any relation to the,
Cedarville. Yeah.
the
They
buggy
had-
people?
Yeah.
Okay.
It was Henny, you know, over to Henny's. It had been quite a place too.
Mhm.
Yeah, it was, the buildings were all on there too. And you looked around and, there was one building that had evidently been a bad blacksmith shop, and in the dirt, in the ground, you could see they had old bellows that had been used on a forge.
Uh-huh.
See it down in the dirt and stuff, but we never dug it out, we should have. But, yeah, it was a big farm, the Henny farm, but it went most of the way over there as far as, the one field really close to Lost Lake.
Mhm.
Probably, you know, not even a quarter of a mile, that one farm field wasn't a farm.
Mhm.
But my earliest memory was them talking about living there and then going fishing there.
Mhm.
Going with my grandpa and we went fishing.
Great, great memories.
Evan Burris online wants to know if there's a picture of the entrance. Did you have one at the beginning?
Yeah, we got a couple of them. Right here?
Is that Greek alphabet on the right side?
Right, yeah, it says, this says Vladimirovo too. Right. Yeah. Yeah, Gail?
You mentioned some acknowledgements that we learned to do halfway through the program.
Those were the acknowledgements. Professor Wyman,
So that was the professor.
Ramey Finch Gerard, and my mother. Pretty much. Yes.
So, 1961 till now, do the residents and the families pretty well have their own school and teach their own children?
No, no school out there. No,
No
no,
school.
no school. All the kids went to, I'm sure at one time, some of them maybe to Cedarville or Dakota, yeah.
Yeah, my grandson is in Dakota school, he's in 7th grade this year, and his friend Nikolai lives out there. And he comes to our house a lot.
Okay.
And he calls up his mother and talks to her in Russian
Okay.
on my phone and wants to stay longer.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, that's the Dakota district.
Dakota.
Yes, sir.
In the mid-80s, when we were still selling gas, I think you remember this, they must have had permanent priests there for a while. Because they had two old Russian Orthodox black, whatever their outfit is, that had long beards. And there was a young priest, who I think was from Texas, and they came over to get gas from us, and he's the only guy that could speak English. And I know he told me he was gonna try and get out there as fast as he could, because he was tired of driving these two old priests around, he was almost like their maid. But I didn't know, and it must have been during the summer, because they wouldn't have a full-time priest there?
They had a part, there's a guy who, he had a full-time job, but he was their priest. I think today, a priest comes over maybe from Rockford.
This might have been summer then, they were two old guys, and they had beards, I mean,
Well,
they played the part.
this St. Vladimir's Day is really a big deal, because when we were there, there was like the Metropolitan of Detroit, Chicago. I mean, he was there, and there were like 3 or 4 other priests out there. So this is a big festival. The families were there, and visitors were there, and I'll bet there was, over 1,000 people visiting there when we were. So yeah, it's a big deal every summer.
John, I worked at the bank in Rock City in like mid-80s, 82, 86, something like that. And I remember those streets coming in the bank, the old
Yeah.
gentleman with one of the younger ones.
There was 2 old guys and 1 young guy.
And when they came in the bank, they would often shuffle their feet.
Yeah,
But
old
somebody,
people do that. I'm one of them. I'm one of them.
so, but one of the tellers asked one of the residents from Lost Lake later, because she saw them and then go to the car and they walked just fine. And they said that was a sign of, maybe you can attest whether this is true or not, maybe, but that it was a sign of respect for the women in there to kind of shuffle their feet and avoid eye contact with us.
I don't know that one.
That's how, so maybe, I don't know, maybe he's pulling her leg, but.
Well, I
I
do,
also remember hearing the younger one say too, he was tired of
Yeah.
but I do have a story, this Father George, who went with us. Father George was a lot of fun. He was a huge guy. He was about 6'3" and 400 pounds. I mean, he was just like a big block of wood, right? And when he came to visit us, we went to Canovas. And he comes, and he had a full regalia. He had his, the cross and everything. And afterwards, I can't think of their names. Beckman, yeah, told me after, he said, that one of their employees said to Linda, Linda, I think the Pope just walked in. But yeah, he was pretty imposing. Here's this guy with the crosses and the white, he had a white beard and everything, yeah. But no, as far as shuffling the feet, and I know nothing about that.
Over 60 years now, are there many of the original descendants?
Hardly, descendants.
Descendants?
Oh yeah, I think a lot of the descendants are still there. Yeah, but the originals, I think there's very, very few. Maybe some who were children in 1961 or maybe teenagers, but yeah. But yeah, a lot of them passed on their homes to their children and grandchildren. Yeah.
Yeah, the one thing I remember too is they started lighting that all up and they planted trees. Man, they planted trees and trees and trees.
I did notice as we went west on Cedarville Road, there's like the residential area, and there's like a wooded area, then there's the lake, and then there's another wooded area, a more extensive wooded area, and then you can really see where the property line ends. There's a cornfield right on the other side there. So
Yeah, it was, east of the lake would have been all farmland until then. There weren't trees over there.
right, yeah.
Does it operate a little bit like an association?
Yeah.
Because you still have a church expense, you still have a clubhouse
Right.
expense, you still have a lake expense.
There is a clubhouse. It looks like it's a clubhouse out there. It really looks like that. It's about the middle of the residential properties. But yeah, it is an association. In fact, the sign there. This is a Lost Lake Vladimirovo Property Owners Association. Yeah, so it is an association.
So they all have a little piece of the ownership.
Yeah. I think that they've got those like 1 acre and half-acre lots, and then I think they all probably in common have certain rights there. I don't know whether they have like a town meeting every once in a while, and set the rules for the place. Probably kind of like a homeowner or a condominium association or something along those lines, I would think. Something like that.
Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else? Well, thanks for coming. It was a little bit different for us to do this other than after a little bit. We decided we were going to do this because we are the Cedarville Area Historical Society. So, but if you want to find it there, you don't know where to, you cross 75, of course, but Vladimirovo is about 7.5 miles east. And then you'll start, you'll at about mile 6.5, you start seeing the woods over there, and that's it, on to the right side of the road. Right. Thanks. We got food, and stick around for a while.
When you go around